Hi-ho, I'm Sarah Mohan and this is Tigress on Tuk-tuk, a show about nature for everybody, but especially for you, my urbanite friends. Okay, so one of the things I always want to do on this show is turn the spotlight on creatures that don't get as much attention. I mean, a lot of us love our birds and our butterflies, but so many creatures are left out of the limelight, forever doomed to obscurity. We can't have that. Especially when the creature in question is enigmatic, despite living all around us. They sing, they dance, hop, glide, jump. They're found in pristine forests and in our backyards. They are harbingers of the monsoon, marvelous choral singers, beatboxers, percussionists, going on all through the night. Any guesses? Aside from the fact that it's already in the episode title. Frogs and toads, amphibians, croakers, peepers, ribbiters, and a couple of other more scientifically accurate collective names if you care to look up frog synonyms. Oh, I've always been obsessed with frogs. And toads, actually. When I was in school and our campus used to flood in the monsoon, I used to scoop up tadpoles from puddles or catch little froglets and take them back home to release them there. It used to be such fun. For the frogs too, I think. I think they had a decent new home. My mother wasn't particularly thrilled, mainly because I'd use my cleaned-out lunchbox to transport them every day. So where I live, frogs have stopped calling now, a clear sign that the rains are well and truly over, winter is ebbing, and we have a summery furnace to look forward to in Chennai. I miss frog song-filled evenings, and this episode is kind of a way to placate that pining. So I'd gleefully put down today's guest on my guest list when I first came across his work on plants. Now, frogs may be his thing, but he's a many hats wearer sort of scientist. He's worked on dragonflies, large mammals, urban trees, bats, wetland birds, hung out in tree canopies all day studying lesser-known entities like epiphytes. I mean, the list goes on. He's probably going to be on a plant-related episode in the future. Oops, spoiler alert. I sat down with him for an interview at his home in Bangalore, and I also took with me a list of questions some of you had about frogs. His molten-eyed golden retriever, Piku, also hung out as we chatted. She mostly snoozed at our feet, but now and then demanded a cuddle, so don't be alarmed if you hear random panting or her claws clicking on the floor in the background. That's just Piku saying hello. Later in the evening, Seshadri, his wife Vidisha, and Piku took me out to a lake nearby for a frog walk. And it was amazing because we heard and saw plenty of our frog friends. But I'm gonna apologize for some anthropogenic audio interference. Snippets from the frog walk do have a loudspeaker going off in the background. This interview happened in October and it was festival time, and you know how every street corner has somebody blaring off. But yeah, it was too much fun to not include, and catching my guests in their element, doing their thing, is the whole essence of this show, right? You guys know this by now. Right, so here we go. Frogs and toads. Are they different things? Frog songs, dancing frogs, frog skin, warts and slime, frog leg delicacies, frog weddings, frog parenting tips, toxins that smell like basmati rice, and discovering a new frog species. That's right, not only does he study frogs and know all about them, but ladies and gents, for the first time ever on Tigress on Tuk-tuk, we are talking to someone who's discovered new frog species and observed frog behavior which had never been described before. He's an ardent birder, a mega history buff, and knows all kinds of forgotten, obscure things. He's a firm believer of focusing on the wonders of nature and introducing the uninitiated to it. He's authored several scientific papers, won many awards, dabbles in poetry, and loves exploring wild spaces in urban areas. Here's the infinitely wise, amazingly unassuming, wonderfully versatile Dr. Seshadri.
Hi everyone, I'm Seshadri. I study frogs and I live in Bangalore.
Would you say frogs are your favorite, like secretly or openly or however?
I'm not sure though. Frogs was an accidental sort of like an accidental discovery, because the first internship that I was looking for after I didn't get through a master's program was on frogs, and it was on roadkills of frogs.
Oh, wow.
My colleague Dr. Gururaj was going out to the field, and I got to know of him from my birdwatching circles.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "Why don't you come along? Let's figure out, do a study, and see if we can publish something out of it." And that's how it all began. It was a 4 or 5 day field trip. It also, and interactions with Gururaj helped me realize that, look, there's very little we know about frogs, and it might be a good avenue to go down or go up, follow up with.
Right.
So that's really how I've been associated with frogs.
Funnily enough, animals weren't even his thing, at least academically speaking.
In fact, my current advisor was surprised to know that I was trained in botany and not zoology.
Right.
So I have a bachelor's in chemistry, botany, and environmental science.
Perfect.
My master's was in ecology and environmental science, and all the animal stuff that I know is either self-taught or learnt in the field looking at things.
So frogs overall get sort of bunched in with the reptile group because of the whole herpetology connection. But for someone who doesn't know any better, what are frogs? And what are frogs?
Frogs are basically a group of animals called amphibians. There are 3 orders. If you know the Linnaean way of organizing things, there's species. A bunch of species are grouped into a genus. A bunch of genus called genera are grouped into something called a family, and a bunch of families are grouped into orders and class and so on.
In the 1700s, Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus came up with the taxonomic system of classification, basically grouping or organizing all life on Earth in a standardized, structured manner that would be accepted all over the world. Linnaeus grouped organisms based on shared or common physical traits into hierarchical taxa. Think of taxa as groups or ranks or levels. The taxa higher up are larger, containing more groups of related organisms, while taxa lower down will contain fewer and fewer groups of organisms until you get all the way down to an individual organism, which is the species level.
Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species.
So amphibians have 3 orders. One of them is the one that we are most familiar with, frogs and toads. These are called anurans. And then there are caecilians. These are legless amphibians, which not everybody is aware of, but they are fairly common as well. And the third group is what we call salamanders. Salamanders and newts are another group of amphibians.
So we have them all in India?
We have them all in India.
Okay.
And
wow, we have
but
salamanders and
only
newts?
2 species of salamanders are found in India, and both of them are found in the eastern Himalaya.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Caecilians are found right along the western Ghats and maybe in the eastern Ghats.
Okay.
Caecilians globally are restricted to the tropics.
Right.
And of course, Caecilians are found in the northeast and the eastern Himalaya.
Got it. Okay. So, frogs and toads, who came first, the frogs or the toads?
Well, there's not really that kind of a difference between a frog and a toad. A frog can be a toad and a toad can be a frog.
Oh.
In the sense that they both came from a common ancestor.
Right.
And the genetic or the morphological difference between the two is not sufficiently wide enough to put them into 2 separate groups or orders.
Today, taxonomy has become more nuanced with things like molecular studies and DNA analysis. Modern biologists use the taxonomic system to create a phylogenetic tree. Ring a bell? Tree of life? All things are connected? Yeah, so this is a diagrammatic representation that looks at how organisms evolved from a common ancestor. All species have a unique position on this tree, represented by the branches, and these branches also trace the evolutionary relationships between them. The more related they are, or closer they appear on the tree, the more recent their common ancestor, and hence they will have more shared traits both physically and genetically. A lot of this is still debated, and we don't have answers to everything, but it has given us structure and helped us figure out a lot of stuff. Like frogs and toads, for example.
The toad and the frog have morphological differences. Toads, for example, have drier skin.
Right.
But the difference between a toad and a frog is the same amount of difference between two families of frogs or two families of toads.
Wow.
But if you look at it on typically as we biologists do on what is called a phylogenetic tree, where you look at the DNA and look at similarities and go back in time, they didn't really originate from different ancestors. They both came from one common ancestor at some point of time, and
Wow. Okay.
we could consider toads as frogs and frogs as toads, although a lot of researchers might kill me for it because it's
Can't believe you did that.
So, differentiating frogs from toads, not scientifically justified. We just made it up, like all the other labels that exist in the world. Under the order Anurans is the family Bufonidae, or the true toads, while Ranidae includes all true frogs. Toads, with their warty skin, their affinity for land over water, their shorter, stubbier limbs, laying their eggs in strings rather than clumps as frogs do, these are all differences that are informally accepted. But, of course, as always, nature reminds us who's boss, and there are exceptions to all these rules that we've made up. Do we know what we are at in terms of species in India? What's our
India is among the most diverse regions for frogs. And I think the current number is around 450 species in India. And about 80% of them are found only, they're endemics, which means they're only found in India. And within India, we have two hotspots. One is, of course, the Western Ghats, and the other is the Eastern Himalaya belt. And these two are recognized global biodiversity hotspots.
Amphibians are one of the most diverse groups on Earth. You'll find them in lush, wet rainforests, in dry, arid conditions. They hang out on the ground, under rocks, or in soil or leaf litter, on trees, in ponds. I could go on. All species have their preferred hangout spots, aka perches.
A perch is essentially where a frog is found. Some of the toads can be sitting only on the ground. There are toads that also live on trees. In our Western Ghats, we have those. We also have tree frogs, which are found anywhere from 0 meters to 30 meters in the canopy. They use the habitat in a rather diverse way. But then stream frogs are stream frogs, tree frogs are tree frogs. You can tell them apart either based on morphology. So tree frogs usually have webbing between their fingers. They have a dilated fingertip so they can cling on to leaves. Whereas aquatic frogs have a complete web and long, like the scuba diving flippers.
The flippers,
so
right.
those kind of things are evident, and you could, if with enough time looking at frogs and sketching them and making notes, you will be able to tell one frog group from another frog group.
There's something trance-like about frog choruses. I can't tell too many frogs apart by their calls, but I always notice how they blend in harmoniously with each other, keep time perfectly, and yet keep their individual voices as well. Apparently, frogs are on a specific rhythm schedule, so they don't exactly sync up their chorus, but each frog waits a set number of beats between its calls, and so often it can sound like they are in unison. It reminds me of my days in an a cappella band where keeping time and harmonizing with fellow bandmates was crucial. Now, a frog's song, its repertoire of twangs, chirps, tonks, squeaks, beeps, and synth-like beats, are super important. Some of you had questions about croaking, and so we really got into frog sounds with Seshadri.
Frogs vocalize in a slightly different way than we humans communicate or the way birds communicate. What we have is an open system of communication. So as I speak, I'm breathing air out of my lungs, going through my larynx and producing sounds, rolling of tongue, rolling of my lips and all that. I don't really have an echo chamber unless I clap my hands and talk loudly. Frogs, on the other hand, have a closed system. So basically they absorb, they take in air, they draw a few breaths of air in, and they close off their nostril, they hold their breath sort of thing, and they push their lungs and stomach, and the air goes through the larynx into their vocal sac, which expands, and then the vocal sac contracts again and the air goes back in and it gets recycled. And that's one reason why it's effective. So if you've heard frogs calling, they call through the night and it can drive someone crazy. You can't get a human to do that. I mean, I can croak for like half an hour, but by the end of it I'll be tired, but a frog doesn't.
Yeah.
And this is a really ingenious solution to this problem of having to vocalize because your life depends on it.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to uh, attract a mate and then mate, and the offsprings have to survive and all those things. And vocalization is an important part of their life.
Right.
And there are frogs that communicate in ultrasound versus
Wow.
those that communicate in a very loud, audible for us humans frequency as well. And but typically you'll hear frogs calling at 3 kilohertz or 4 kilohertz.
It's usually the males who do all the vocalizing, mainly to impress the ladies, and also to defend territories. The females also make sounds now and then, but it's never anything elaborate. Males take this serenading very seriously. There's no mimicking another call or anything else that might throw off a potential mate. What you hear is what you get. Now, every species has a unique set of calls, and it's possible that individuals within a species can sound different. Seshadri says we simply don't know enough. What we do know for sure is that frogs are master communicators. They know when to say exactly what. Now, there's something we humans struggle with.
You're my closest friend, and I don't even like you.
So we found that two groups of frogs, two distantly related groups of frogs found in the Western Ghats, use vocal repertoire, and they both have a vocal repertoire of calls, and they use them in different sequences depending on the context. So it's like how as science communicators you talk to your audience. If you're talking to a 5-year-old, you have the same message in a different format versus a scientific meeting where you have the same message in a very different format. Frogs seem to be able to do that, and this was a collaborative work with my colleagues in ICER Pune. And what we found was there's one species called Nyctibatrachus humayni. It's called the Humayne's night frog. It's a little brown job which is it's aquatic and lays eggs in shrubs and leaves overhanging water. They have 2 notes in their call. The second note is added when there's a male around. When the male is not around, this individual makes just 1 note. And the other species we looked at was a tree frog called Pseudophylatus amboli. These are tiny little frogs half the size of your thumb, and they have up to 6 different note types, which they vary depending on who is around and how close they are. So, for example, when there's no one around, or within a certain distance, of course, the frog produces a single note call. And when there's a male really close by, when they engage in physical contact or fight for a territory, it uses a different note type and uses it more repeatably. These vocal sequences, communicating in vocal sequences, is something we are familiar with humans. Me communicating to you is a primate talking in sequences, and this helps us. One, it's a humbling thing where it puts us in place, saying, "Okay, boss, you're not the only one who can do sequences. A tiny frog can also do it."
Right.
The other is to look at how or what pathways did it take for these things to emerge. What's the evolutionary significance of having 2-note call versus a 6-note call? And one best example of this is the Tungara frog from Central America, where people have looked at this frog, which again produces a chuck and a whine.
So, male Tungara frogs of South and Central America have 2 kinds of calls: a simple whine and a complex whine plus 1 to 7 chucks. In their playback experiments, scientists played both calls and found that females actually have a preference. They are more likely to hop over and say hello to the crooner who uses the complex calls. So then, why do all the guys not always do the sexier thing and use only complex calls? Well, they come at a cost. Lurking about in the jungle are frog-eating bats and blood-sucking flies, also listening intently, and they are attracted to these hot, complex calls more than the simple ones. So the males gotta choose between finding a lady and staying alive. Changing up their frog song is a good middle ground. Complex calls are used when in a group. It helps them stand out. When alone, keep it simple. This way, they might get lucky and survive the night. What about the other froggy senses? Do they have good vision, hearing?
They have really good senses. Their eyesight is pretty good for a frog. That's like half the size of your thumb. They can see color because they are colorful and they do perceive color. And there's increasing evidence that even in the cover of darkness, they can perceive shades of color.
Wow.
They can perceive movement. They might not be able to precisely gauge the depth of field because unlike humans, their eyes are not front facing, they are side facing. The other thing that you asked about was their hearing. Frogs can hear, and they have large, not necessarily large, they have apparatus called the tympanum, which is basically our human ear without the earlobes. It's basically what's inside is outside for frogs, covered by a skin membrane. And with tympanum, there are various shapes and sizes. There are frogs with tympanum as big as their eyes or larger than their eyes. Or there are frogs that tympanum isn't visible at all.
Right. Wow. Another question was, do we have any poisonous frogs out here? Also, how do they get their poison?
Good question. And I'm happy that you said poison because a lot of people say venom. There is, I think, a venomous frog as well.
Okay, quick sidebar on venomous frogs. We've only found about 2 in the world so far. The year is 2015. In a Brazilian forest, scientist Carlos Jared is busy hand-collecting lesser-known frog specimens to take back to his lab to study, something he's no doubt done scores of times before. He picks up a warty, slightly nondescript blob of browny grey. It's the Greenings tree frog. Suddenly, hot white streaks of pain pulse through his arm. He'd noticed that the frog, on being picked up, had head-butted his hand. Unusual thing for a frog to do. As the searing pain surged through his arm for the next 5 hours, his colleagues and him figured out that he'd just been hand-kissed by a venomous frog, first one ever recorded on the planet. Soon they found another, the Bruno's casque-headed frog, also venomous. Unlike poison dart frogs, where the skin itself exudes toxins, these two inject venom into a predator's mouth, or a human hand, whichever is bothering them, through small spines sheathed under their skin, particularly around the upper lip. Hence the head-butting, hand-smooching action which helps stick out the spines. Though he figured this out the hard way, the scientist was fine, and thankfully nobody picked up the Bruno's casque frog, because its venom apparently is lethal. Scientists believe there could be other venomous frogs hopping around in South America. Not to worry, no venomous frogs in India, and as for poisonous toads, you don't have to worry unless you're a predator of some sort.
There are poisonous frogs in India. Toads are a great example. Most of the toads where we've looked at have something called Bufotoxin. Bufo is the word for toad.
Yeah.
And recently people have started examining the contents of this toxin, and it's known to be so potent that it can stop an animal's heartbeat in a fraction of a second.
Wow.
It works as an effective deterrent for predators. And this is fascinating, and it takes a bit of a backstory to understand why it's so fascinating. And I talked about frogs using vocalization to attract a mate, right? That makes sense. But then if I'm a frog sitting out on a leaf or under a rock calling for a female, it's an open world out there, and it's not just the female that's listening. There could be another animal that can listen to this call, eavesdrop, and then pick up the individual. So there's an evolutionary cost. The male has to survive calling for long enough time to attract a mate and then reproduce. So a vocalizing frog has to overcome the risk of predation, and there are multiple ways of doing it. One is to hide somewhere and call, but then it's kind of counterintuitive because you're hiding and nobody's going to find you. The other is to hide in a place where you can reverberate the sound and make it louder than it seems. Stuff like the frogs calling from inside bamboo reed. That might work. The other thing is to look very cryptic, have skin pattern that matches the background and so on. It's slightly more effective, but there's a limit to that. The other is to acquire toxins and go like, nobody's gonna mess with me because I'm toxic. And animals learn these things, right? These are learnt cues, and bright colors and toxins are often associated, and we call it aposematic coloration or aposematic signals.
Aposematism.
These are bright colors or combinations of colors that can tell the predator immediately that, hey, look, this is distasteful or poisonous, don't eat it. An entire group of frogs in South America use this, the poison dart frogs. Back in the 70s, there was a researcher who looked at their diet and found that they were eating ants more than anything else, and they were assimilating the toxin from these ants.
Wow.
That's one extreme of it, and the other extreme is in India, where we have these toads that have toxin. Common toads are found in the cities, and they have two large glands on their neck. They don't really have a neck, on their back, which secrete a white, sticky, strong, pungent smelling substance. It actually smells of basmati rice.
What?
And, yeah, I've smelt it. And there is one,
Okay.
I know one researcher, I can't forget his or her name, who went around tasting frogs to see what.
Wow.
Yeah.
What, did you just picked
Yeah.
it up and licked it?
Yeah, licked them and noted down the taste and.
Wow.
Yeah.
Bertie Bott's every flavour beans. I was most unfortunate in my youth to come across a vomit-flavoured one. And since then, I'm afraid, I've lost my liking for them. But I think I could be safe with a nice toffee. Alas. Earwax.
I think more than being lethal, they might just be distasteful. But animals learn these signals, and
Yeah.
this is an amazing strategy for a frog to overcome the cost of being cool and sexy and visible to not getting eaten up.
Yeah.
And that's always a trade-off, and it's fascinating how frogs manage to do
Yeah.
this. And
You were talking about their skin, and so the frog's skin is everything, right? Is it its most important organ? And
yes and no. In one sense, they do help them. Their skin does let them breathe. Their skin also functions in giving them color. Frogs have 3 layers of color. These are called chromatophores, and they can open independent of each other, and that's how you can see frogs changing from a darker shade to a lighter shade, or
Oh, wow.
changing from yellow to brown, and so on.
right.
So it does let them help in camouflage and or be conspicuous. The other major thing about frog skin is because they are moist all the time, they are highly susceptible to fungal infections, and most frogs have a mechanism to prevent fungal infections, and we call them antimicrobial peptides. These are small protein chains that help the frog fight off any infection, and that's where the future of applied research is going to be for us humans, because we might be finding the next cure for a fungal infection in frogs.
Right.
In fact, in India, there was some work a couple of years ago which looked at frog secretions and its ability to prevent influenza virus. So they basically took frog swabs and put them in a petri dish. One was a control, the other was a treatment where the virus was introduced, and it didn't do well. So there's definitely a great potential for, I know exploiting is the wrong word, but then
Tapping into that.
using things from frogs.
Yeah. So, is it also this quality then, the sensitivity of their skin and with the kind of barrier that it is, that also sort of gets them to be indicators of the environment?
Absolutely, and that and everything else about the frogs is making them the most threatened vertebrate on the planet. We have, I think, I don't know the numbers of how many frogs have gone extinct, but in our recent history, in the last 30 to 40 years, there have been at least a couple of frogs that have gone extinct. One of them is the charismatic gastric brooding frogs from Australia. These were frogs which would lay eggs, and the males would then, at some point in the development, swallow the eggs and brood them in their mouth.
Wow.
Gastric is the stomach breeding
Right.
frog thing, but they would actually develop in the mouth, and the baby froglets would jump out. It's an incredibly diverse form of parental care, and unfortunately they got wiped out. A lot of frogs in South America are on the verge of extinction because of chytridomycosis. It's a fungal infection that's affecting these frogs, and it's known to have originated from the Korean Peninsula, somewhere in that part of the world,
Right.
and got into South America via the pet trade. Pet frogs would get transported around, and the native frogs didn't have any sort of immunity for this new pathogen, and they just succumb to it. In India as well, we have chytridomycosis, but the strain is from Asia, and our frogs seem to be doing okay with it.
Okay.
But I would take it with a bucket of salt, because there's nobody out there monitoring what's happening to frogs. So this is one part of their skin, is one part of the thing why they are sensitive to the environment. The other is they are ectotherms. Their body temperature is dependent on the outside environment, right? Unlike humans, they can't regulate their temperature. And given that different species occupy different kinds of habitats, they have what is called as thermal tolerance, beyond a temperature beyond which they will not be able to survive. And I think that's a big issue that we need to start recognizing, given that climate change is here and it's happening. The other important thing that is pushing frogs to extinction is probably something to do with their diets. We don't know enough about what's happening to the food that they eat. A lot of frogs are known to consume insects, but then we also are documenting a global decline in insect populations in the last decade. Like if you have gone in a car on a highway, you would remember the number of insects that would be stuck on the grill in front or the window screen, and that doesn't happen today. And this probably is to do with the abuse of pesticides, or because of something else, and we don't know enough to connect these two. But in a rather common sense way, frogs eat insects, and if the insects are declining, what are frogs eating, right? Or how is that affecting the frog populations? That is something that we need to start. We should have done this yesterday, but it's not happening. And of course, there is pesticide abuse, and at least in the US, there's been documented evidence of a chemical called atrazine, which is known to mess with the hormones of frogs. The males were turning into females.
Oh my gosh.
That's an issue that we need to think about, and again in the Indian context, with so much of agriculture happening, forget the habitat disturbance, forget the habitat that's cleared. Even in habitats where frogs can persist, we simply don't know what's happening to them, because our paddy fields are loaded with pesticides, and companies only look at what is called LD50 or LC50, which is lethal dose and lethal concentration at which 50% of the test population dies.
Wonderful.
We don't know anything about how the remaining surviving population is actually getting affected.
And is it that they sort of are like a canary in the minefield, in an underground mine, sort of indicating other sort of ominous things for other creatures, including humans, up the food chain?
They might be. Actually, we don't really know if they are very good indicators, because if you think of it from trying to find them in the forest, a canary is probably more easier to find than a frog, because you have to go out at night, because that's when frogs are most active, most easy to detect. And when you're out there at night, and usually frogs are active in the monsoon, the odds are already smaller to detect a change coming from frogs. But if we had a monitoring system where somebody was looking at that proverbial canary, then yes, they definitely would be telling us that something is not well. But we are in a situation where we think there's a canary, but nobody's looking at it. And unfortunately, every time somebody has done this, where they've gone and looked, they have unfortunately found mostly negative things that are happening to the environment.
Seshadri says that not enough scientific studies have attempted using frogs as indicators of other things going on in the environment. But, it's not rocket science. You can see it for yourself. Places that had frogs maybe a decade ago don't have them anymore. Something's knocking them off the food chain. Overall, it's not a great time to be an amphibian. Scientists estimate that over 200 frog species have gone extinct since the 1970s. If you're thinking frogs and toads are delicate, squishy marshmallows, they aren't. Their ancestors survived the asteroid that killed the dinos, but now we've gone and pushed them into the high-risk category. Between diseases, climate change, pesticide use, and loss of habitat, they are sitting ducks for extinction. As if that were not enough, we've also turned them into a delicacy. Somebody wanted to know, I've heard that frogs are eaten in China. Is this true? As far as I've heard, they're eaten much closer to home, right?
Frogs are eaten everywhere. And I think they continue to be eaten not just in China but all parts of the world. It's part of either it's part of a fancy delicacy thing or part of native culture.
Right.
People eat it, and one good thing that happened in India was in the late 80s. I think it was Humayun Abdul Ali, who used to work in the BNHS, a relative of Salim Ali, who managed to force the government to impose a ban on frog leg trade. Initially, until then, the frogs were being exported from India, and they would go to the European market and from there to everywhere else. And the part that was used was the leg, and it's still used. Just that after the ban came in India, the entire trade shifted to Indonesia and Malaysia.
No.
In India, whatever frog consumption happens at a much smaller scale, and it's mostly as a local delicacy, regional specific thing. But it's surprising how surreptitiously this might be a big thing as well. I have seen the forest department seize a bag full of bullfrogs in one of my field sites. So I think culturally also we are setting up this scenario where we value these frogs less than we actually should. The other threat that probably goes beyond frog leg trade is the pet trade, because it has immense consequences like the chytrid fungus. Salamanders are also traded globally, and a couple of years, I think 5 years back, they discovered a new species or a different species of fungus that's restricted to salamanders.
Yeesh, none of that makes for a pleasant story. This ain't no frog fairy tale. It feels like there's not much hope for these songsters. The truth is, we need to be doing a lot more to understand amphibians and find ways to help them out. I think we need to be doing extra, because while many frog and toad species have been wiped off the face of the earth, new species are being discovered, almost simultaneously. So it's entirely possible that we could be killing off undiscovered frogs before someone finds them. Apparently, about 3,000 new species have been found in the last 25 years. In India, about 200 plus species have been described since the turn of the millennium. Crazy, right? Well, Seshadri himself is a species discoverer of not just one, but 3 frogs.
I mean,
That's exciting. I've never
I mean,
spoken
it is.
to anyone who's named something before.
I mean, calling names isn't fun, but it can be. It can be with frogs because it's unique in 2 ways. One, whether I like it or not, my name is now part of biological history or scientific history.
Yeah.
And I think I had the privilege to be able to recognize something that was unique and coin names. And in all the 3 cases where I discovered, or when I say I, it's usually a group of people.
Of course.
When we discovered a frog, we consciously decided to name it after something meaningful. So the first frog that we found was in the forest canopies of in Tamil Nadu, where I was working. It was a patch of forest close to a tea plantation called Kakachi, and it's one of the oldest patches of forest that have. It's effectively a corridor. It's called a 1 mile corridor back from the 70s, and it connects 2 patches of wet evergreen forest in an island of in a sea of tea plantation.
Wow.
So we found it there, and we called it Raorchestes Kakachi, just to emphasize that this place is unique. And it turns out the frog is also found in neighboring areas, but this is essentially where we found it. The other 2 frogs were found in human-dominated areas again, and one of them is a tiny little frog called microhyla. Micro meaning small, and hyla is the hyloid bone that helps us make sounds.
Okay.
And we found it in a area that's dominated by laterite rock. Laterite is it's an ancient, geologically ancient kind of rock formation, and it's again abused, extracted, mined, used like it's nobody's business. And these frogs are found only in those kind of rocky areas, and we called it microhyla laterite.
Okay.
In an attempt to bring attention to these laterite habitats. And the third species that we described was again from a human-dominated landscape in the coastal Karnataka region, and we called it Euphlyctus Karavali. Karavali is the Kannada word for the coastal region, and we thought this is the apt name for it. And again, this frog is threatened because of the habitat change that's happening along the west coast.
I noticed that you the last two species you mentioned were in urbanized areas. So, what are the most sort of common culprits that usual suspects in urban areas, and what sort of habitats can humans expect them in? Should it be a certain way? Should they have access to certain things?
I think frogs in urban areas is not something new. People have been seeing. I mean, I grew up seeing frogs and toads in our houses, and this was a time when there was a garden in front of the house, and I remember seeing bullfrogs, the ones that turn yellow and vocalize all day. Actually, they're more active in the day than the night.
Hey.
And I've seen toads get into our houses, and tree frogs sitting behind picture frames and all that. But at maybe around a decade ago or 15 years back, frogs started disappearing from our area. And now that back then I knew nothing, now that I think of it, I think it's to do with concretization of the place. People started building houses, covered every inch of soil that was there in their front yard, and what happens is that it prevents any movement of animals. So these are essentially barriers for movement. Back then there were gardens, and there was a bare patch of soil, and there were insects there, and there was moisture. The frog could be living there, and if they didn't find enough food there, they could always move to the neighbor's garden and so on, and they could move up and down the landscape, and that's not happening today.
Yeah.
And especially in the core of the city, I don't think you'll see a frog unless you go to a large garden or a large park.
There's no end to our fiddling in urban landscapes. Things we do in the name of beautification and management really screws up the lives of all other creatures that share city space with us.
In Bangalore, what we have done, and probably in other cities as well, what we have done is, so we are modifying lakes. Instead of having one side as a deep end and and a shallow end on the other side, we now have fish balls where JCBs are brought in, the mud is dug up, they make an island in the middle, and the lake is too deep for any meaningful ecological interaction.
Right.
Frogs need varying levels of water. They need a sloping embankment where they can hop onto and feed on plants. And once we get into a fishbowl design, we pitch the embankment with stone. There's nothing that grows there, and when nothing grows, there are no insects, and you won't get frogs feeding on anything there.
Fortunately, the lake we visited was an older one and still fairly intact, at least in terms of structure. Despite the tone-deaf loudspeaker man in the background, the whole walk was damn cool for a couple of reasons. Firstly, at this site, we spotted a mound of great historical significance. And this is also where I found out Seshadri was a big history buff.
This is Sampige Halli Kere. Okay. Sampige Halli auxiliary station is up there. You'll see a little mound there up ahead. Okay. Once we go there, I'll show you. Okay. That's one of the auxiliary stations where they calibrated the chains that they use for the trigonometric survey.
Oh wow! To measure the height of the Everest? Yep. Okay, go Google the Great Trigonometric Survey. Now my second reason, the frogs, of course.
We should probably... So that's a pond frog, Euphlyctus hexadactylus. The call that you just heard. Yeah, that's Euphlyctus hexadactylus. Kick.
Nice. Gosh, that call is amazing.
I'm going to come back here with a sound recorder.
And on a night when...
quieter night and record these calls because nobody has described the call of the species.
Pond frogs were described in 1834 by the French naturalist Lesson, but people have had them mixed up with the Karavali skittering frog, which Seshadri and his colleagues had described a few years ago. That one has a different call, kind of like a kingfisher, but it looks quite similar to the pond frog, and so they got lumped together as one.
The other landscape change that we have brought in, even in gardens and parks, is this crazy fascination for lawns. I mean, lawns are great, they look beautiful, but they're biologically useless. There's nothing that grows there, and they pump in a lot of pesticides into maintaining this grass fields as well.
Yeah.
All these things work in a synergy to get rid of frogs and every other organism, not just frogs, it does more harm than good.
Is that the end then? I mean, there's no hope of welcoming them back?
It needn't be. It's actually very easy to bring frogs back. And what can be done in cities is we could begin by creating habitats in which frogs can live, and a population can be sustained. What I mean is, if we can think of creating a little wetland in the house, if we have a little garden, with today with the internet and with access to resources, it's very easy to pull off. Even in individual homes, and if it's a larger scale setup, like all the IT industries and all the big mega working spaces that we have in the city, if they could invest in a bit of ecological sense when constructing buildings, we could get a lot done by attracting not just frogs but dragonflies and snakes and lizards and everything else into the city.
In most Indian cities and urban areas, the common toad is perhaps most common of all. In southern India, you'll find the painted frog. The Indian tree frog is another species often spotted in the suburbs. Lakes or ponds can attract the common skittering frog. Other species you'll spot or hear, particularly during the monsoon, are species of narrow-mouthed frogs and cricket frogs. We saw loads of these during our frog walk. Since I was with a frog scientist who knows how to safely handle these creatures, I got to see one right up close. But generally, the golden rule is to never, ever, ever handle frogs.
These are called microhylas. The trrr, trrr, trrr. So this is a microhyla. In the background, the one that you hear is called a minervaria. It's called the cricket frog. This is microhyla ornata.
And of course, the crickets themselves.
And there are crickets, yes.
Yeah.
The constant one you hear is a cricket. So this one is probably Minervaria bengaluru. They named a species after Bangla.
Okay.
I think it's them. I don't know.
Does that mean you don't find them anywhere else?
No, they're found everywhere.
Okay.
These are one of the most common frogs in India.
Okay.
The cricket frogs.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And
goodbye.
One of the studies that we have done on these frogs, we found that they eat a lot of insects, ranging from spiders, crickets to little leaf hoppers.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Compared to the microhylids, which exclusively eat ants and other hymenopterans. So that's the group of
So
insects.
they're all insectivores then, frogs?
Primarily insectivores.
Are
they cannibalize.
Right.
They also eat, the bullfrog also eats chicken, like baby chicken.
Oh my god.
And pond frog actually eats a lot of leaves.
Okay. So that brings me to, I guess, one of my final questions, which is most of the time people's reactions are either, oh my gosh, take it away from me, or I also think it's, when I've been talking to people, it's sort of out of sight, out of mind, right? They're largely ignored. Was there anything that you'd like to say to that? Like, especially to urbanites, A, we need these frogs and why we need them, and B, how do you sort of address this large sort of oblivious existence that we have when it comes to frogs?
This notion of frogs being disgusting is not new. Carolus Linnaeus, the father of taxonomy, when he described the class Amphibia, he wrote a text in which he's used all kinds of negative connotations on frogs. He calls them foul and loathsome organisms with slimy skin.
Okay, I have to butt in here. So in his pioneering book, Systema Naturae, which forms the foundation of modern taxonomy and classification, this is how he described class Amphibia, which at the time lumped together amphibians and reptiles, and boy oh boy did Carl Linnaeus hate snakes. So his general attitude towards this whole group is not great. Here's what he wrote. These foul and loathsome animals are abhorrent
because of their cold body, pale color, cartilaginous skeleton, filthy sheen, fierce aspect, calculating eye, offensive smell, harsh voice, squalid habitation, and terrible venom.
Venom. Oh, mother of pearl. Biology owes you a heck of a lot, but you were so wrong about this, Carl. So wrong. Unfortunately, in many parts of the Western world, people aren't big fans of frogs. They were linked to the underworld and considered evil and symbols of witchcraft and death. But they have also been portrayed positively, associated with things like fertility in indigenous folklore, fables, fairy tales, and Greek mythology. Froggies have also got a positive spin in modern pop culture.
Hi-ho, this is me, Kermit the Frog.
And in India too, you'll find some cool frog references.
Our perception of frogs hasn't changed as much compared to what Linnaeus had. But then in parts of India, there seems to have been observations on frogs in popular culture going back, predating Linnaeus. We have, for example, in the Rig Veda, a set of hymns or a hymn which talks about the changing of seasons and how the arrival of the monsoon results in the emergence of frogs of different color. They go on to describe the shape and the color and the pattern of the frogs and describe their calls. So the hymn actually talks about how a frog that is green has spots on it, bellows like a cow, and there's one more that is smaller and brown and it bleats like a goat. And if you think of it, the goat thing is probably the skittering frog, which kind of goes like kee, kit, 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 kit. And the bellowing like the cow might be the bullfrog, which goes like
Yeah.
So, moving a little further, we have this temple in Sringeri where there is this story about a frog which Shankaracharya basically came down south to India and was wandering along, and he was looking for a place to set up the religious school. He came across this river, the Tunga river, and he saw a frog which was in labor, and he saw a snake, a cobra, opening its hood up and protecting the frog from the perils of the environment. And he said, this is the most pious or most positive place for me to set up my ashram, and that's how the Sringeri temple started. That's the story, and I went in search of it and I did find this snake statue, but the frog is rather nondescript. You can't really say it's a frog. And I don't think the frog was in labor. The snake probably was trying to eat the frog. But that's the biologist in me, and I can't contest any of these. And of course, frogs are part of a lot of idioms, right? A frog in the well, Kupamanduka as we call them. So the most popular idiom, two of them I can think of, and we use it in India, is one of it is a Kupamanduka. It basically refers to someone who is really has a tunnel vision kind of thing, where they're stuck in one lane and that's all they know about. Proverbially, it means a frog stuck in a well is always stuck in a well. It doesn't know the world beyond it. The other is putting a bunch of frogs together in a weighing scale. At least in Kannada, there is a very effective proverb that we say. Working with these people is like putting frogs in one weighing pan.
How do you say that?
Kappe takdi gakodu is what we call it.
Okay.
Kappe is the frog, takdi is the weighing scale, and
Right.
it basically says it's impossible to get all these people to agree on something, because if you put a bunch of frogs, they'll jump and each of them do their own thing. And unfortunately, this thing has also transpired into Indian herpetological scene, where it's very, very hard to get researchers to work together. And I, as a person with no background in classical zoology, I find it surprising, because a lot of the plant guys seem to be happy with working with each other. And with frogs, it's been like, this is my domain, this is your domain.
Interesting.
And I find it ridiculous, because all of our lifetimes put together isn't enough to study frogs, or isn't enough to know about them. So
I've also heard of these frog weddings and things, which I thought were...
They do have frog weddings, and it's funny though, in the last couple of years, so Gurraj, my colleague, has been observing it and noting down when they do it, and it's a very popular thing in Western Ghats, at least in parts of Karnataka. I don't know about other places.
Really?
I think
Even in peninsular India? I thought it was a thing in the northeast.
No, it happens in the Western Ghats also.
Wow. Okay.
So again, it's a very popular culture, and initially I used to frown at it and think of it as a ridiculous thing, but some of my colleagues made me realize that, look, you can look at it in a way that people know that rains and frogs are associated, and they might not there might not be any logic in the process that they're doing, but the thought of it is that if frogs are happy, if frogs are around, then we'll have the rains. Although it's the other way around usually. It's elaborate. Like there's a priest, there are people dressed up like they go to a wedding, and they catch these two poor males and they...
Do they feed them any bugs or anything?
I don't think they do.
No?
But they mishandle them. It's unfortunate that it happens. They are kept in a box, in a small tiny box without water, and they're handled. And frogs are ectothermic, right? And if we handle them for too long, they can get into a heat shock. Or if we handle them wrong, they get injured. And these are unfortunately the downside to the whole frog wedding thing. But hey, if someone can work with these people and turn things around, it's a great hook into conservation. It's a great way to get them on board. To say that if you don't protect this lake, you're not going to have rains, and you're not going to do these weddings, and you're going to get bad karma. So that's a very effective way to get people
message. Yeah, absolutely. All right, my last question, and this was when I put out on Instagram if people had any questions on frogs, and a lot of the ladies wanted to know, where is the promised frog prince, or are they for real? Will my frog prince turn up, or will all the frogs I've kissed turn to a prince, maybe? Or do frogs actually like being kissed a certain way? So I'm not sure all the science you've done will ever help you answer this question.
No, you should probably ask my wife though.
No, but that got me to thinking.
The short answer is don't kiss a frog.
Right. Like your colleague who went around licking them or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, don't do it unless you are a trained, even if you're a trained professional, don't do it.
Right. Trained professional in science, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, scientist, not a professional kisser or anything like that.
Right, but got me to thinking, seriously, do frogs display any kind of affection or any other kind of kinky mating behavior? Not necessarily kissing, but to each other, of course.
Well, they do have elaborate forms of courtship. Vocalization is one part of it.
Yeah.
We have what we call the foot flagging frogs. And the popular notion is that the frogs wave their feet to attract a mate, which is bunkum. They don't do that.
Okay. Oh.
They actually wave their feet to mark their territories and ask the other male to get out.
The rest of you gentlemen can bugger off!
Because researchers in India have collaborated with people abroad and done experiments with wax models and robotic models, and they've tested for sure that waving your feet doesn't attract a female frog.
Okay.
It basically deters other males from a little perch. And the vocalization is what attracts the female.
Okay.
Almost always. The other thing that I have been fascinated about, although nothing to do with mating, it's to do with parenting. There's a lot of parental care behaviors that are known in frogs, which it blew my mind when I came across this. And this sort of work was the part of my doctoral thesis, where I ended up finding this frog inside a bamboo reed. And I, being myself, I cut open the bamboo reed and saw that there were eggs inside. And I knew about what are called direct developing eggs, where the eggs are laid away from water. They hatch directly into froglets. They skip the free living tadpole stage, and these direct developing eggs can be vulnerable to predation by whatever forces in the environment. And usually, whenever there is direct development, there's some form of parental care.
Yeah.
So it's usually the male who sits and guards the eggs, or it's the female, or both. Depending on what species, there's some combination of it. And what I found was the male was sitting with these eggs and guarding them for up to like 30 or 35 days until they hatch. And I did experiments where I would artificially remove the male from a bunch of eggs. I'd find 2 clutches of eggs in similar habitats and similar sized bamboo and similar distances from water and all those things. So all else being equal, only the male is missing or the caregiver is missing. What happens to the eggs? All this was happening inside bamboo, and I was not able to cut the bamboo, so I used an endoscope to look through these things on a little computer screen in the rain with an umbrella. And
nice.
I would go every night and count the number of eggs, take photographs so that I could measure the development. And we realized that the eggs were either missing one at a time, or the whole thing was gone. And one night we got lucky when we saw a frog in a treatment where the male had removed. We had removed the male. There should not be a frog inside it, and then there was a frog inside it. And we slowly nudged the frog out, and we realized that the clutch was missing 4 or 5 eggs. And when we caught hold of the frog and saw its belly, it had 5 little bulges. And that's when we realized that there are males that are hanging around these bamboo cavities that are coming in and cannibalizing the eggs. Because eggs are great food, right? I mean, we eat them, frogs eat them. And the male who's attending to these eggs is probably guarding them from a cannibalistic male of the same species.
Right.
And this was a fascinating discovery for us, and it's the only study in India it's still the only study in India that documents the adaptive significance of parental care. We know parental care is beneficial for the offspring and all that, but very few studies actually provide the evidence to back this up.
And that is how Seshadri and his team described a whole new, never seen before reproductive behavior in the Ocalandra bamboo reed frog. If you're wondering how frogs got inside the bamboo in the first place, it was through little holes made by the Nilgiri striped squirrel. Seshadri added that what makes this story even more special is that the frog, the bamboo, and the squirrel are endangered and endemic to India. Frogs around the world have some crazy, super elaborate methods of parental care. They could probably write a book on good parenting. Wow.
And again, every time you look at frogs, there's something new that pops up.
And so like us in so many ways.
They're way better than us.
Exactly.
They're way better than us. There's a lot of sociobiology as well. There's a social construct in frogs. They don't necessarily live in families, but there are interactions between individuals, male, female, male, siblings interacting. There might be a lot of it going on.
Yeah, we have no idea, of course.
We're scratching the surface.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this. This was most eye-opening and enlightening. I've made the mistake before of thinking frogs are hapless, slightly clueless, delicate darlings. As we've just heard, that's far from the truth. These serenaders and smooth operators know exactly what they want and how to get it, and in many ways are a sign of a healthy planet, something we need. So the next time you spot or hear one of them, thank your lucky stars and hope they stick around. Big thanks to Seshadri for his collection of frog calls, which you heard throughout the episode. You can follow him on Instagram at Seshadri.K.S and keep track of his work and adventures. In the show notes is a link to his blog and a great little poster that him and others have put together on Bangalore's frogs, but it's a great tool to identify common frogs and toads anywhere in India. Follow the show on Instagram and Twitter at Tigress on Tuk-tuk, and remember to leave a rating if you're listening on Spotify or leave a review on Apple Podcasts. You know what? We're officially midway through season 1 and it's been such a fun ride, you guys. Okay, I'll be back 2 Thursdays from now. So long.